Today's episode is brought to you by thecollector.com. If you're into mind-blowing dives into ancient history, philosophy, killer art breakdowns, or even epic travel spots with a cultural twist, visit thecollector.com. Stories to teach, inform, and inspire. Paris, 1939. Europe is holding its breath. War feels inevitable, but daily life continues. Cafes are full, newspapers still hit the streets. And amid this tension, a series of brutal murders captures the city's attention, even as a far greater catastrophe looms just beyond the horizon. In his new book, The Typewriter and the Guillotine, historian and journalist Mark Braude takes us into the uneasy moment, following an American reporter, a German serial killer, and a city distracted by violence as the world edges toward collapse. It's a story about crime and journalism, but also about how societies fixate on perhaps the wrong threads at exactly the wrong time. Mark Braude is the author of The Invisible Emperor, Napoleon on Elba from Exile to Escape, and Making Monte Carlo, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post. A quick word from our sponsors. Mark, welcome to History Shorts.
Thanks, Peter. Lovely to be here. Been looking forward to it.
What was the inspiration for this newest book? Was there some kind of a moment where you're like, whoa, I want to know more about this? Or was this like a long time coming kind of thing?
It started about a decade ago. My specialty is in French history, and I'd come across this case of this German, Eugen Weidmann, who was the last person publicly executed in France. So he's executed by guillotine in front of a crowd. And this isn't, the 18th century, this isn't the 17th century. This is 1939, June 1939, outside of the Versailles prison. And so just that fact alone of like learning that there had been this German who ended up being, I found out he was a serial killer and a con man. And that the date, June 39, the French state executing this person just really struck me of like, what's going on with this story? And it was definitely in that category of something I wanted to know more about. And I started digging a little bit, and then other projects sort of took over, and I had books to write, as you know. And so that one went in the drawer, but, kind of nagging at me. And then for my last book, I was writing about Paris in the 1920s, the art world. And this writer, this woman named Janet Flanner, kept popping up in my notes, in my research. She was the New Yorker's correspondent from Paris in the 1920s, really the magazine's first foreign correspondent in its history, right there from the founding. And she always had these, whatever I was looking at in that city and in France, she had these great things to say about them. Super funny, super smart, really kind of cutting, and a great writer as well. And she was always threatening to take over this book that I was writing about artists. And so I was like, well, Flanner, I really want to follow her. And she's going to be the subject of my next book. So I started reading everything she ever wrote. Turns out one of the last pieces she filed before fleeing France in 1939, before the war is breaking out, is about this execution of Eugen Weidmann. And, bing, there goes the bell of like, I remember that guy from 10 years ago. And here are these two intersecting stories. And it turned out she covered him, in several pieces. And so following her and then also getting back to that case, that original case, and looking at what it was. And his case is just so much more bizarre and complicated and layered and more significant than I had imagined. I realized there that was the book that was following the two of them in this period, going from the 1920s of a sort of more freewheeling, idyllic kind of Paris into this very dark time in the 1930s, weaving their two stories together and finding out what was going on, what was significant about these two lives sort of intersecting in that city just before the war.
Yeah, so a couple of things in here. Before we get into introducing these two main characters, I think you kind of touched upon this idea of the scene, because in the previous book, 1920s Paris is glamorous, right? And then now you shift to this more grim 1930s. How did this city change in that decade? Because you have the ability to look at the research you've done the decade leading up to it. So not a lot of historians could say, like, I could see that change, from like haven for artists, or expatriates, you might say, to kind of a place that's shadowed by fear and impending war and refugees and all that stuff. How did the city change?
Yeah, so my most recent book was called Kiki Man Ray, and it's about the artist Man Ray, the American photographer, and Kiki de Montparnasse, who was a performer and an artist, and his muse and a model. And so I was really looking at this really bohemian enclave of Paris in the 20s. And like I said, it was quite effervescent and full of life and a really open society. And one of my big arguments in that book was that Paris in the 20s was Paris in the 20s because it was the most open society on earth at that point. France welcomed something close to 3 million immigrants in the 20s, more than any other European nation. And a lot of that has to do with the rebuilding efforts. And so I'm not saying that it was a place free of xenophobia or hatreds, but it was really this cosmopolitan and open society. And I think that went hand in hand with all the innovation we saw there. But that's really writing about a party. And most of that book focuses on the 20s. The 30s is really the hangover in a sense, right? And I wanted to address that because I realized when I finished that book on the 20s, and I started to think about some of the peripheral characters, people who had passed through that world, this really open society, and I followed them to the end. A lot of them wound up, dead and murdered, many in concentration camps. And so I felt, that there was this other story that really does need to be told hand in hand. The 30s in France was a very, very complicated place, highly polarized, deep divides between men and women, left and right, rich and poor. And I think that, it really was a place where fascism existed and made serious inroads. And I think sometimes that gets overlooked, that, because of the lines that were drawn in the war, that there really was this popular surge towards hard right politics among many in France, And so I wanted to look at those divides, and again through the eyes of this reporter, this journalist Janet Flanner, who really gets to all facets of society. I could look at it from all sorts of different angles and try and get at what was going on there.
She's a fascinating character as well. I mean, openly queer in an era which kind of risky, but living in Paris with relative freedom, relative to say the least. But her personal life, her relationships, her American identity, even you might say, all this outsider status, how do you think that influenced her reporting on this crime, but also on the politics and on the darkening mood in Paris at the time?
Yeah, so Janet Flanner, she was about 30 when she came to Paris in 1922, and with aspirations of becoming a novelist and living with a woman named Solita Solano, another American, also a writer, and kind of fell into this job at this new magazine called The New Yorker that her friends had founded in 25, with this idea of like, hey, send us, fizzy accounts of what's going on with fashion and art and music, drama and all that stuff in Paris. The New Yorker audience will love that. And she did that, and with great joy. And it was kind of like a gig for her, as she's trying to chase down her dream of becoming a novelist. And what happens as the 20s go on, and she's everywhere at once, really in this lively city and in this country where so much is going on, she finds that that's actually what she was meant to do. She's very she writes under the pen name Genet, and highly stylized, really smart, really funny, always cracking jokes. Has this kind of gimlet-eyed view of what's going on, and so that becomes where her real artistry shines through. And what she's drawn to is very high and very low. So she's good at like the sort of ritzy, aristocratic party crowd, what's going on in the cafes, and then she's really drawn to what she calls low life. So like jewel thieves and gangsters and all those kinds of stories. She says the middle is boring. She doesn't want to be in the middle. And what happened to her is that as Europe changed, she changed. And that's really the core of the book, of like saying, when the world changes, when history changes, and you have a job, and your job no longer feels in step with the times, what do you do? And it was very easy in that situation, as we see the rise of authoritarianism, of fascism coming in, and she's here, this arts reporter, of just throwing up her hands and saying, like, I don't know what to do. I give up. She gets depressed, like so many around her. The world seems to be going to hell. After that, she kind of goes towards it, goes towards the danger. And she starts to use her humor almost like a sword rather than a shield. And she says, no, 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 I can still write in the way that I write. I can still be funny. I can still have style. And I'm going to apply it to writing about Hitler. She writes the first big magazine profile of Hitler, a three-piece series in the New Yorker, where she talks about his love of sweets and all sorts of crazy details about his life. And it seems again that she's doing this sort of strange, witty take on a character, just as she would profile an artist. But through that way of doing it, it's a kind of a Trojan horse. And she starts to introduce, what does he stand for, and what is it doing to Europe? And she's really there on the ground when so many Americans are still relatively ignorant about what's going on. And she's passing along what's happening through her own particular style, but really starting to inform Americans, especially, about what's changing. She's right there on the front lines.
So what, or rather, how did she come across the villain of our story? And would you say that he perhaps served as like a microcosm for her for like the broader evils that she was witnessing? Because there was that fascination with him. How do you think that developed, and where did that come from?
So this guy Eugen Weidmann, in 37 and 38, goes on a sort of killing spree, and gets caught in this kind of sensational fashion. And there's this big trial. So he killed 6 people in and around Paris. 2 of his victims were Jewish. One was a young woman from Brooklyn. And like everyone in Paris, Flanner is gripped by this case as it happens. I mean, this is, his capture is in late 37. And then he's in jail for much of 38. And this case is like competing on the front pages with all the crazy political and military news that's happening. It's front page news. And Flanner's job, as she says, is to kind of soak up what's happening in Paris and then pour it out in ink every 2 weeks for the New Yorker. That's how she describes her directive. So this is big news. And she says, well, now there's the American angle of this woman who's been killed. I think American readers will be interested in this. But she wasn't quite sure how to approach it, whether to ascribe it any more significance than just this is kind of a grisly crime or not. And as she started to pay attention, to talk with people, and as the trial gets underway, she realized, aha, this is about Germany and France. This is about, what do you do with an evil that you can't understand and can't contain, and it all hinges on, is he going to be executed? Clearly, he's guilty, and he admits his guilt. But the trial is about, now, what do we, as a civilized nation, France, do with this monstrous German in our midst? And the French, authorities know that Hitler is watching. They know the Germans are watching, and they know the world is watching. How do you handle this evil that you can't kind of understand? And without giving away too much, there's a really ingenious defense strategy arguing about how accountable is this man for his crimes in France, and what do we as a nation do with him? And that becomes the crux of the case. And as Flanner reports on it, and as I follow her, she does see it as, yes, this is a way to sort of try to understand this evil that we're seeing, and how do we grapple with it? You can't even fathom its depths.
It's also, and you kind of briefly mentioned that this June 39 public execution by guillotine is the last one in France, right? I mean, this was an event that was, I guess you might say, historically altering. How do you think that event is still remembered today in history? Is this still a gripping event, or do you feel like you are resurrecting and bringing this back to the surface as something that might have been overlooked over the years?
Yeah, I think now it occupies the space of probably just a strange anecdote. I think the book will change that, because it looks at it quite in depth. But at the time, it actually changed French law. So this man was carted out at dawn in front of hundreds, and executed, and it was filmed, and it was photographed, and the photographs ran in papers. And the reaction of the crowd was so barbaric um, that the French state quite quickly after that execution said, okay, now we're going to start doing these behind closed doors and only with invited people. The guillotine was actually still in use for decades afterwards. Um, but the public spectacle side of it was taken away. And so for a while, that case was remembered among opponents of the death penalty as a landmark case, because the argument was, well, now that you've taken away the public spectacle side of it, maybe the argument that it becomes a public deterrent is less effective, and this will usher in the end of the death penalty. And so there, for legal scholars and for people who are interested in that side of things, it remains a kind of landmark case.
You had a lot of different archives, Flanders' own archives and columns, obviously to work from, right? There was a lot of rich material there. But I assume that weaving in the two stories, we kind of talked about it with the first question, it brings some challenges, right? Because you're talking about the geopolitical rise of fascism, but you're also talking about a personality here, with her own social views on life and social place in life. And you're also talking true crime, like a killer story. So I assume there were some challenges in balancing this like thriller-like element with larger historical narrative. Did you come across any, or was there anything that for you kept on saying to yourself like, okay, focus? Was that ever an issue?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the first goal here is really to entertain and engage. I'm not ashamed to say that, as a professional historian and writer who spends a lot of time in the archives, my ultimate goal at the end is to make a readable book, and in this case, a readable thriller. But there's also the goal of showing, the process of being a reporter and getting into this reporter's head, this writer's head, what it means to really care about facts and about measured takes on a really quickly changing situation. And I found her quite heroic in a way of she really is somebody. What I liked about her was she wasn't instantly just saying, we're all on the right side of history and I'm against fascism from day one and it's horrible. She takes her time to make up her mind. She sees the appeal of right-wing politics. She tries to understand it. She herself is somewhat seduced by it in the 30s because it's a tough time. She says, well, these people are getting things done, while the parliamentary democracies seem to be stagnating. And so, and eventually comes to realize, no, they're trying to gobble up the world, and I have to change myself accordingly. And I like that she changed. She's not a simple hero. She's a complicated woman, and trying to make up her mind as she goes. She really dislikes communism, and so that is her great fear, as it was for many people. However, though, in her circle, that was made her unpopular. So she was kind of an outsider among outsiders, which was also doubly interesting. But the question about the archives is really at the key. The book rests on some really great material. And so shout out to all the institutions and the staffs of those places, because without whom none of this would be possible. So I'm thinking of the Library of Congress, which has Flanders Papers, the New York Public Library, which has the New Yorker records. And then there's this little library near, that handles Versailles that had thousands of pages on this trial that I'm looking at. So, everything from the police reports to the actual trial transcripts to witness tests. I mean, there's just endless stuff, which was great to dig into. But that's the kind of stuff that no matter what you think you're going to do going in, it really is shaped by what you find. I see, you're nodding because of course this is, this too. And so, like, for instance, I'll just give one quick example because I could go on and on and on when it comes to archives, because this is like what I love. I'm sitting in the Library of Congress and it's just like thumbing through Flanders stuff, and I see an invitation with big swastikas on all the corners, and it's a press pass, and it's Janet Flanders' press pass. She was invited to a Nuremberg rally as a VIP guest in 1935. So she sat there in the front row, watching all these goose-stepping soldiers. So there I'm instantly conjuring this, this scene, and here's this terrifying document that she held onto for her life because she saw that it was valuable. I turn it over, and there in her cursive handwriting, which I've come to recognize because I've seen her other writing, are just a bunch of lists of flowers, just names of flowers and plants. And my theory based on the timing and what I know about her and what was important to her in her life, is that she's thinking about what to plant in her one of her friends' cottages in rural France, because it's coming time to planting season, and she's thinking about flowers. So does that happen on the train ride back from Nuremberg, where she's freaked out of her mind and she's just trying to find some peace, or is she doing it in some sick way while the thing's going on? I mean, is that possible? So those kinds of things, these documents of somebody that's touched this and you're right there with them, and what would it be like to be at the Nuremberg rally, and again, with trying to withhold judgment and seeing it through her eyes and based on what she wrote. Again, it's not instantly that she's horrified. There is also an aspect. This is somebody who cares about aesthetics and filmmaking and art, and she sees the rally as, wow, this is an amazing production, first and foremost. It sounds crazy to say that today, but again, these are the kinds of things that you can do with history, of like, you jump back in, you see it as it's happening. You're not always right. You're not always seeing everything. You're seeing what's in front of you. And that to me was just absolutely fascinating. And there were countless examples of that in the archives, especially with her.
I completely agree with you with this idea of the people that work at these institutions don't get enough credit, and whenever I'm doing research, same thing. When I'm just like, they bring out that teal box, and then they give you the gloves, and you're like, okay. And as I'm doing research, every time whoever works at these organizations, they're always like, oh, I also thought you might find this interesting, just based on the conversations with them. And now they're bringing out things that you wouldn't have even thought about when you initially got there to look for certain files, and they're so helpful. And I feel like these guys, these men and women, that just should be definitely given a lot more credit, that work at all these various archives, because they are super helpful when you're there doing this research.
Exactly. And I've worked all over the world, and it is one of the things that America has done well with its wealth. These institutions are amazing. And I'm sitting at the Library of Congress one day in my own little world, and then I see a little crowd gathered at the desk next to me, and I'm like, what's going on? There's about 5 or 6 people. And somebody has like an original copy of a speech from Lincoln. They're holding it in their hand. And I'm like, what? I mean, this is amazing. So yeah, the people who work and the people that support that, I think, as you say, it doesn't get recognized enough, because there's so much knowledge gets produced because of that.
Yeah, I literally just came back 3 days ago. I was in Ohio doing research, and I got a chance to go on board of the B-29 boxcar super fortress that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. It was surreal. First of all, they don't open it. They usually open it like every few years to do a radon inspection. So it took about a year for me to get permission to go on board. This was at the U.S. National Air Force Museum. Everyone was super nice to get me, but just walking on board, they pull down this ladder, and I'm standing inside an aircraft that dropped the atomic bomb. It is, like you said, when you touch history, it is something else. And I'm thinking to myself, like, how can I convey this through the pages of me writing about this or talking about this? Like, you can, but you can't. You know what I mean? Like, it's different, but it's amazing that a lot of this history is preserved. One thing I want to ask you before I let you go is, I don't know about you, but like, just reading your book, it is primed to be made into like mini series on Netflix, because it does have that thrill aspect to it, right? And with that in mind, did you at any point think of who might play your leads?
From your lips to Hollywood's ears, I guess. I never did think about that, actually. Strangely enough, it's not a satisfying answer, I know. And we could.
That's fine. Well, because you also know what they look like. That's another thing.
Exactly right. It gets to be so crazy, and I kind of have to find myself. I have to catch myself, because I find myself talking about this person who was dead before I was born, Janet Flanner, as if I really knew her, and of course I don't. And so this is the other thing that is we always have to keep in mind with history is, I spent years and years with Flanner in the archives. With her most intimate details. She's talking about her sex life. She's talking about her desires. She's talking about her illnesses. She's talking, about good and evil and life and death. And yet, right? How well do I know her at the end of the day? We try to act with respect and empathy and be a fair judge and not let her off the hook when she's misbehaving as well. But yeah, so that one, it's like, it's like saying, who would somebody you would play that somebody that's related to you. It's kind of hard because I know her so well. So I don't know, but how about this? I'll put it out to anybody who has their Dreamcast can send me an email, and I would love
Perfect.
to. Look, there's two juicy leads there. I won't deny it.
Absolutely. I don't know about you, but whenever I work on a project, I always come across things that I'm like, that could be my next project. And, and it goes in the pile. But was there anything during this research where you kind of went off on a tangent and you're like, ooh, like it grabbed your attention just long enough to be memorable, where you're like, this could be an article or a book or something else? Did you come across any points here?
Yes, definitely. And because you're smart to ask that question, because this happens, and it's always fun to talk about it too, because what the thing that could have been. And for me, it was in the book and it stayed in the book, but it was in my mind about 800 pages longer. So thank my editor for getting this down to a realistic length. And that was the 1937 Expo. So Paris hosts the World's Exposition in 37, which, of course, is a really highly charged moment for an international exposition that's supposed to be all about peace and cooperation. And the main thoroughfare, right where, the Eiffel Tower and down the Champ de Mars and all that stuff, where they had the expo grounds, the two big pavilions are the USSR and Germany. And they're facing off against one another on this concourse. And they're competing to be who's the highest, and there's so much going on, and that's Picasso showing Guernica at the Spanish pavilion for the Spanish Republic. I mean, it is just an amazing microcosm of that world and that time. And I'm like, oh, I want to hang out in Expo Land for 400 pages and read everything. And yes, maybe I lost 6 months of my life to go down that rabbit hole, and now it's probably a chapter. But that was definitely the thing where I was like,
that's. You talk about editing. It's like killing a baby. There are times where I've written like 3 chapters on something, and it's like, no, we're just gonna compile it to one. I'm like, you just cut out like 15,000 words.
That's my life.
It's my life. I'm like, you don't understand. 15,000 words, that's weeks. Weeks of my life.
I feel like if you start looking at it in terms of time, as I just did, you can drive yourself nuts. But it's all to the good, right? It's all, and it helps you understand, like, this 400-page book you're reading is actually 1,200 pages in its heart, but it's been whittled down. And that's the job. Keep it tight, keep us interested, and then I think the good stuff comes to the top, which is all nice as well.
So my last 2 questions, Mark. First one, what are you currently reading, and what do you read for fun? Or I guess it's a 3-part question, either or. Either what are you reading now, what do you read for fun, or is there any books that you read recently or in your life that kind of really stuck with you?
So right now I am reading Hermione Lee's biography of Tom Stoppard, the playwright who recently passed away. And it's really outside of my wheelhouse. I know some of his stuff, but I don't know it well, but it was a guy who really interested me. He's kind of famous for the play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is how I knew him. And I'm reading about this life, and it turns out he's quite fascinating. Dropped out of school or left school basically at 17, never went to any college, and writing these kind of amazing stuff, and really has a lot to teach us. So, and Hermione Lee, is a great biographer. So that, but that's probably out of character for me. I'm mostly a fiction guy. Interesting, because I'm doing so much with fact that to unwind at the end of the day, I want to read some fiction. So the one that I just is a reread for me, which is kind of cruel because there's so much in the pile that remains unread. But I got back to Don DeLillo's Underworld, which is like, what a towering, amazing, crazy 850 whatever it is page book about America in the 20th century that just teaches me history in a way that nonfiction can't, and gets really into this secret history, this history of the soul of America, the history of I would recommend that book to anybody who has some time on their hands, because he's just a master, and it's just, I think it's probably up there in my pantheon for sure.
I agree with you, though. I mean, I also have a pile, and my wife and I always compete because, she reads different books than I do. She does not like history, but the piles are always growing, and we're like, we'll get to it. But I do read a lot of fiction, and you're right, because I read so much nonfiction for what I do, that it is kind of like an escapism thing. Like I mean, read some fiction. And sometimes I've had some authors on here that write historical fiction. So that kind of, for me, it's like, okay, two birds with one stone. I think I'm going to have Robert Harris in a month or so
He's great.
on the show. So I'm really excited by that because I've read so many of his books. But this idea of, I feel like it comes across in writing as well, because the way you wrote The Typewriter and the Guillotine, it is a thriller, but it's a nonfiction thriller. And you definitely see inklings of fiction style writing. Does that make sense? It's very readable. So I think we learn a lot from reading fiction as nonfiction writers. Would you agree? I mean,
yeah, and it's all that elemental stuff of like, you're around the fire in the village, and how are you going to keep, what are you telling the villagers? They want beginning, middle, and end. And what is great for me about history, because I don't have the inventive capacity of a fiction writer, is that there is this built-in motor, which is chronology. As long as we're moving through time, stuff is happening, and your job is just to kind of find the through line and why it makes sense. And again, you have to respect what's happening, and you can't be overly determined. But as you go, the book starts to take shape, and that's where the archives sort of help and guide you. I've always felt, the book I propose and the book I write are always very different, because I learn, as I go, and that's the discovery. And the hope is that the reader is discovering as well, as you are, which keeps it all exciting.
Perfect. Mark, where can my listeners go to learn more about your work and your other books and, what you're up to, I guess?
Yeah, the easiest way would be markbraude.com, which is markbraude.com. Come find me, say hi, drop me an email. And yeah.
Mark, thank you so much for taking the time. This was awesome.
Hey, man, what a pleasure. This was great. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in once more and helping make this little humble show successful. If you have any comments or questions, you could shoot me an email at peter@historyshortspodcast.com. Or you could visit www.historyshortspodcast.com or look for History Shorts Podcast on Facebook, X, or Patreon. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you all tomorrow.